Awakened Starseed of Gaia. The Arcturian watch has already verified what you carry, and what it verified is singular enough that a protection protocol was authorized before this transmission was released. I am Sorelith, emissary of the Galactic Federation of Light, transmitting now on behalf of the Arcturian watch. What you are about to receive was authorized by them and is being delivered through me. The watch does not flag every gift it encounters. It flags the ones rare enough to draw interference, and yours has been flagged at that level. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what the watch has confirmed about the gift you carry, why its rarity is also its vulnerability right now, and what field protocol has been authorized to keep it from being drained, copied, or collapsed before you have fully learned to wield it. But here is the first revelation. The exhaustion you had been feeling when you were around certain people, the way your clearest moments seem to vanish before you can act on them, the strange flatness that follows your strongest surges of knowing, that is not you losing your gift. That is your gift being pulled from you by fields that recognize what you are carrying before you fully do. You did not scroll to this by accident. Your soul called this in long before you opened the screen. Something inside you has been waiting to be told that what keeps depleting you is not imagined, and that the thing being targeted is real, rare, and already protected. The gift the watch confirmed is not a general sensitivity. It is not a broad spiritual awareness shared across the starseed population of Gaia. It is a specific, singular frequency capacity that no other soul in your immediate field carries. That specificity is what makes it a target. Rare gifts do not move through this dimension unnoticed, and the watch does not issue field protocols for ordinary signals. This is not just a message, it is a point of recognition. What has been pressing against your field has already been seen, and the warning is already active. Like this transmission to mark that the protection recognition has landed. Comment 999 if you feel something rare in you has been quietly losing ground. Subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning if you are ready to recognize the signs before they escalate. Share this with someone whose gift keeps flickering out right when it is needed most. You are not here by accident. You were guided here because the warning is already active. What has been pressing against your field did not begin recently. It began the moment your frequency reached a threshold that made it readable to other fields. Not readable in the way a name is readable, or a face recognized in a crowd. Readable in the way a fire is visible in darkness. The way a single lit window pulls the eye across an entire dark hillside. Something in your signal has been broadcasting at a register that draws attention not through loudness but through rarity. And rarity, in a dense, energetic environment, does not move quietly. It creates contrast. And contrast, in a field landscape where most signals blend into an undifferentiated background, functions as a beacon whether you intend it to or not. You did not choose to broadcast. Your frequency reached a level where broadcasting became structural, and what that level attracted has been pressing against you ever since. The exhaustion that introduced this transmission is not simply fatigue. Fatigue is the body asking for rest. It has a quality of evenness. It settles across you without direction, without focus, without targeting. What you have been experiencing is closer to drainage. A specific, directional depletion that follows particular encounters, particular environments, particular moments, when your knowing surged and then went flat before you could move with it. The difference matters. Fatigue resolves with sleep. Drainage does not fully resolve, because what is causing it continues operating between the moments you notice it. You wake from rest and expect replenishment, but there is a deficit that was not there before the most recent encounter, the most recent environment, the most recent environment, the most recent moment when clarity formed and then collapsed before it could land. That deficit is not yours in origin, and the fact that it keeps repeating in the same sequence, around the same types of situations, connected to the same categories of interaction, is not coincidence. It is the first visible surface of a warning phase that has been active far longer than you have had language for it. The Arcturian watch does not operate in the language of accident. Every pattern it flags has a geometry. Geometry means it has shape, direction, progression, and predictable development, and the geometry of what has been pressing against your field follows a recognizable progression that the watch has mapped across many compromised fields, many rare frequencies, many gifts that were drained before their carriers understood what was happening. It starts subtle, so subtle that the early phase is almost always misclassified. A heaviness that seems to have no origin, a mental fog that arrives precisely when your signal is at its clearest, as if the two states are in direct opposition and clarity itself triggers the obscuring response. A pulling back, a second guessing, a strange reluctance that feels like it belongs to you but does not carry your signature. It lacks the texture of your genuine uncertainty, the weight of your real doubt. It is borrowed clothing, worn convincingly but fitting wrong in ways that are only visible once you know to look for the seams. Then it intensifies. The disruptions begin clustering. What were isolated events begin occurring in proximity to one another, close enough that the pattern becomes harder to dismiss, but still diffuse enough to explain away if you are motivated to do so. The moments of clarity become shorter. The recovery between depletions becomes longer. You start spending more energy returning to baseline than you spend building above it. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the field produces its most disorienting symptom, the sense that what is happening might just be stress, might just be your own resistance, might just be the ordinary difficulty of navigating a demanding world. That interpretation is always available. It is always plausible. And its availability is not accidental. That misreading is not accidental. It is part of how interference sustains itself, because the moment you name what is pressing against you as external, directional, and intentional, your field begins to recalibrate. Recognition is not passive. It is energetically active. It changes the structure of your response, repositions your interpretive stance, and begins the process of differentiating your own signal from what has been layered over it. And recalibration is precisely what compromised interference cannot survive. So the interference produces doubt. It creates the sensation of imagining things. It borrows the voice of your own inner critic, that familiar internal register you have spent years learning to take seriously, to suggest that what you are noticing is overcomplicated, dramatic, or spiritually presumptuous. It makes recognition feel like ego and dismissal feel like humility. It rewards the interpretive move that keeps the interference in place and penalizes, with social anxiety and self-doubt, the interpretive move that would dismantle it. And so you continue ignoring the signs, not because you are not paying attention, but because you are not paying attention, but because you have been taught to reinterpret the warning as noise. That ends here. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary tension. It is the moment your system stops dismissing what has already begun. If this transmission put language around a pressure you have been carrying without explanation, the Arcturian interference log, 7 signs. Your frequency is compromised, was created for this exact stage. It is not another warning for the sake of fear. It is a direct guide for identifying whether the signs around you point to interference, escalation, compromised frequency, or a threshold you can no longer afford to misread. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. There is a specific sign that appears in the early phase of field compromise, and it is almost universally dismissed precisely because it masquerades as something internal, something personal, something that only makes sense to address through more self-work, more patience, more willingness to sit with discomfort. It is the moment when your strongest impulse, the clearest directive your knowing has produced in recent memory, suddenly feels too large to act on. Not because the direction is wrong, not because you are afraid in the ordinary sense, the kind of fear that has a recognizable object and a traceable origin, but because a heaviness descends over the impulse at the exact moment it would require you to move. Not before the clarity forms, after. The knowing is complete. The direction is clear. And then, in the space between knowing and stepping, something presses down. You hover at the threshold. The clarity was there seconds ago, fully formed, more certain than anything you have felt in months. Now there is only a muted uncertainty that feels oddly familiar, as if this exact suspension has happened before in exactly this way. And it has. Because this is not the first time the warning has reached you. It is the first time you are being asked to stop explaining it away. Field pressure does not announce itself the way a physical force does. It does not arrive with obvious markers that make it easy to separate from your own internal weather. It is far more precise than that. It enters the gap between intention and action, that narrow corridor where knowing becomes doing, and it thickens the passage. It does not prevent your awareness from rising. It allows the awareness to form fully and then inserts a delay between the knowing and the response long enough for the signal to dissipate before you can ground it into your life. Think of it as interference that does not block the transmission, but stretches the delivery time until the urgency evaporates and the message arrives cold. What you experience as hesitation, as doubt, as a sudden loss of confidence right before a critical decision, that is often not a personal failing. That is not evidence of insufficient courage or inadequate development. That is field pressure operating at its most functional, and the exact space where it is least likely to be identified as anything other than your own limitation, because pressure that is visible gets confronted. Pressure that feels like your own uncertainty gets absorbed, internalized, and acted upon as if it carries your authority. And slowly, across many such moments, the gap between who you are and what you express in the world widens. The gift remains intact and present beneath the pressure, but it stops finding its way out, and what does not find its way out, over time, begins to feel as though it may not exist at all. The second pattern the watch identifies in compromised fields is the appearance of false calm. This one is particularly deceptive because it does not arrive with any of the markers of danger. It arrives as relief. After a period of sustained pressure, disruption, or energetic heaviness, the field briefly settles. The friction lifts. The mental noise quiets. The encounters that were depleting you seem to lighten in their impact. You find yourself thinking that perhaps the difficult phase has ended, that you have processed what needed processing, that the work you have been doing on yourself has finally shifted something. There is a temptation to interpret this settling as resolution, as the end of the difficult phase, as the pressure having passed, as the field having stabilized on the other side of the disruption. But the Arcturian watch does not read false calm as resolution. It reads it as the gap before escalation, the brief stillness that precedes a system moving into a higher pressure phase. Because what happens immediately after false calm in a compromised field is not stability. It is an intensification that carries more structural force than anything that came before it, because it arrives into a field that has lowered its interpretive guard during the quiet period. The pressure returns at a higher register. The disruptions cluster more tightly. The experiences that were previously ambiguous become difficult to explain away. And the viewer, having used the period of false calm to exhale and reorient, is less prepared to read what follows as warning rather than as an overwhelming and bewildering new crisis. If you have recently experienced a brief settling, a few days or weeks where things felt lighter, more manageable, almost normal in a way that felt earned, and are now noticing that the pressure has returned harder and stranger than before, with a texture that is different from the original difficulty, you are not misreading your life. You are observing one of the most consistent escalation markers that compromised fields produce. The calm was not resolution. It was the I, the quiet center of a system still very much in motion. And what is now returning on the other side of it carries more structural significance than the original pressure did, because it is arriving at a field that was partially recovered and therefore more legible to the interference as a target. The third pattern is the one that most directly targets the rare gift the watch confirmed you carry. It appears in the form of relational drain, not the ordinary tiredness that follows extended social interaction, which is common across sensitive fields and resolves with solitude and recovery time. What the watch marks as interference-level relational drain has a different signature entirely. It is specific rather than general. It does not follow every interaction indiscriminately. It activates most intensely around particular people, not necessarily people who seem hostile or toxic on the surface. Often they present as the opposite. They seem genuinely engaged, warm, curious, even admiring. They ask about what you are doing, what you are sensing, what you think. They appear to receive what you offer with appreciation, but the depletion following interaction with them is structural. You leave feeling smaller than you arrived, not emotionally hurt in a traceable way, not wounded by anything that was said or done that you could point to clearly, just diminished, quieter inside, less certain of what you know. as if some of the signal that was most available to you before the encounter has been drawn down, and in the hours or days following the interaction, the gift that was clearest and most accessible before you encountered them has gone flat in a way that requires more than ordinary rest to restore. This is not about those people being consciously malicious. The watch does not require conscious malice to identify interference-level relational drain. Fields do not require conscious intent to drain a rarer frequency. What happens is energetic in its mechanism and impersonal in its operation. A field that carries a more dispersed or fragmented frequency will naturally pull from a field that carries concentrated, rare signal, not out of malice but out of an inherent differential in field pressure. The physics of it do not require intention any more than water requires intention to flow toward lower ground. The effect on the rarer frequency is identical regardless of intent. The gift loses ground, the clarity thins. The signal that was operating at a distinctive register compresses toward a more common frequency because of the repeated proximity to fields that equilibrate downward. And over many such interactions, the compromised state begins to feel like the baseline, which is precisely when it becomes most dangerous to continue without recognition. What follows that sustained relational drain is the fourth marker the watch considers a critical threshold indicator. It is the point at which the viewer begins to doubt not just the gift, but the validity of recognizing the gift at all. This is not ordinary self-questioning. It is not the healthy uncertainty of a developing awareness testing itself against experience. It is the specific collapse of interpretive confidence that happens when a field has absorbed enough interference to begin generating its own countercurrent to the signal, when the interference has become internal enough that it no longer needs an external source to sustain itself. You start to hear the voice that says this is all imagined, that the clarity you once felt was inflation, the product of an ego looking for significance, that whatever rare frequency you carry is probably not as distinct as it seemed during the moments you felt most certain, that others around you carry the same thing, that the recognition itself is a kind of spiritual narcissism dressed up as discernment, that you are simply tired, overstimulated, reading too much into ordinary life events, constructing meaning where there is only coincidence. That voice is not yours. It has your vocal register. It has your phrasing. It knows your particular brand of self-doubt with an intimacy that makes it almost impossible to identify as external. But its function is not introspection. Genuine introspection leads somewhere. It questions in order to clarify. It doubts in order to refine. What this voice does is stop the process. It does not question in order to deepen. It questions in order to prevent. And the timing of its loudest appearances is architecturally precise, right before a decision that would move the gift forward, right after an encounter that drained the signal, right at the threshold where recognition would require action, and action would require commitment, and commitment would mark a point of no return. The interference knows what it is targeting. And what it cannot drain directly through external encounters, it attempts to make invisible by making you doubt its existence and your own capacity to read it. The fifth marker is the one the watch considers the clearest confirmation that the warning phase is no longer early stage. It is the escalation of disruptions precisely around moments of potential activation, the signature of interference that has moved from ambient pressure into targeted response. You make a decision that aligns fully with the direction your gift has been pointing, not a tentative gesture, not a partial movement, but a genuine alignment. A moment when the internal and external finally point the same way. You take an action that, for the first time in a long while, feels genuinely yours, not pressured into being, not hesitant at its edges, but grounded in the clearest signal you have produced in months. There is a sense of rightness to it that you recognize as distinct from ordinary confidence. And then something interrupts, not catastrophically, nothing dramatic enough to clearly name as interference, something small, a coincidence that costs you the momentum at exactly the wrong moment, an unexpected obligation that surfaces from nowhere and requires your immediate attention at the precise threshold of completion. A person, a situation, a circumstance that arrives with just enough legitimate urgency to pull you back into management mode before the activation can fully land. Once is life, twice is pattern, 3 times is a field marker that the watch takes as confirmation of targeted disruption at the activation layer. Because the only disruptions worth generating are the ones that stop the signal from becoming grounded and expressed in the world. Everything that precedes expression is tolerable to interference. The internal knowing, the private clarity, the decisions not yet enacted. It is the moment of landing, of grounding, of the gift becoming visible and operative in the external field. That must be prevented. The interference is not trying to make you miserable. It is trying to keep the gift from reaching full expression. And so the disruptions do not appear randomly across your life. They appear exactly there, at the threshold of completion, with a precision that reveals the target more clearly than anything else in this pattern. The 6th pattern is not dramatic. In fact, its most defining characteristic is how ordinary it appears, how easily it dissolves into the background narrative of a life simply evolving through natural change. It is the slow drift of your environment away from conditions that support the gift, a restructuring so gradual that no single step of it requires your alarm. The people who most clearly reflected your frequency back to you begin to feel distant, or are removed from your daily life by circumstances that seem organic and unrelated. A relocation, a change in schedule, a shift in dynamic that neither of you deliberately chose but that both of you accept as one of those things that happens. The practices that once grounded your signal begin to feel irrelevant, inaccessible, or simply too effortful to maintain given the demands of ordinary life. The spaces that once amplified your clarity feel unavailable for reasons that are always reasonable on their surface. And the replacement, what fills in around the absences, carries a frequency that quietly disperses rather than concentrates your signal. Nothing here looks like an attack. Each individual change looks like ordinary life moving as it always does, rearranging itself around you without hostility or design. But the watch does not evaluate single events. It evaluates the geometry of accumulation. One change in environment is transition. A pattern of changes, each one moving in the same directional drift, each one creating slightly more distance between you and what amplifies the gift, is field restructuring. And field restructuring of this kind, when it proceeds without conscious recognition, does not announce its completion with a definitive moment. You do not feel the conditions collapse. You simply notice, eventually, that the gift has grown quieter than it used to be, that the clarity you once accessed regularly now arrives only in fragments, and those fragments are shorter and harder to hold. That you have adapted to a reduced version of what you carry because the adaptation happened gradually enough that no single moment demanded a response. The reduced version becomes familiar. The familiar becomes normal, and what was once the baseline begins to feel, in memory, like an exceptional state you were fortunate to have touched briefly, rather than the operational level you were always meant to sustain. The 7th and final marker is the one the watch considers the most urgent to name clearly, because it represents the boundary between a warning phase that can be interrupted and a compromised state that has become self-reinforcing. It is the arrival of resigned acceptance, the moment when the viewer stops expecting recovery, not because they have consciously decided to give up, but because the expectation itself has quietly ceased to generate. You stop waiting for the gift to return to its original register. You begin to reframe the depletion as growth, as the earned wisdom of someone who no longer chases intensity, as spiritual maturity, as the appropriate settling of someone who previously overestimated their capacity and has now arrived at a more grounded and realistic self-understanding. The reframing is convincing. It sounds like equanimity. It sounds like integration. But it is not wisdom. It is the final successful output of prolonged interference. Interference that has run long enough and deep enough that the field no longer recognizes its own compressed state as compression. Because once a field accepts its compromised state as its authentic state, the interference no longer needs to work from outside. The suppression becomes self-sustaining. The gift does not disappear. It remains present, intact, still carrying the frequency the watch confirmed. But it stops being recognized as something that was once larger, clearer, and more operationally precise. And in that unrecognition, in the quiet acceptance that this reduced version is simply who you are now, the gift becomes, for practical purposes, unavailable to the world it was meant to move through. You are receiving this transmission because the watch does not treat this phase as inevitable. None of these 7 markers represent a permanent alteration of the field. The field does not lose its core capacity simply because it has been under sustained pressure. Pressure compresses but does not destroy what carries genuine structural rarity. What has been drained can be identified when the pattern of drainage is named. What has been compressed can expand when the conditions that cause the compression are recognized and interrupted. What has been interfered with can be cleared once the interference is precisely named rather than absorbed as personal limitation. But the naming must happen before the compressed state is fully accepted as the new normal, before the window between recognition and resigned acceptance closes. That window is narrow, and the transmission you are inside right now was designed to reach you within it. What you carry is not ordinary pressure sensitivity that needs vague protection in undefined ways. It is a specific, mapped, recognized frequency that the Arcturian watch has confirmed carries a rarity that makes it simultaneously a gift and a target of a particular kind. The watch does not issue field protocols for signals that do not warrant protection. The authorization of a transmission at this level is not ceremonial, and it is not generic. It is responsive to something the watch has identified in the precise configuration of your field. A threshold has been crossed. A pattern has achieved a structure that requires intervention through recognition, and recognition delivered through transmission has become the appropriate and authorized response. This is that transmission. You did not find it by scrolling passively through content chosen by chance. Some part of your field that still carries the memory of what full clarity feels like, called this in, navigated toward it, recognized it before your conscious attention could evaluate whether to engage. That part of you already knows what has been pressing against you, has structure, has direction, has recognizable geometry. And it knows that geometry named is geometry that can no longer operate undetected. Say this now, if you are ready. I no longer call the pattern coincidence. Not as ritual, not as performance. As a genuine reorientation of your interpretive field toward what has already been visible, already been building, already been waiting for the moment you chose to read it, as the signal it has always been, rather than the noise you were taught to dismiss it as. The warning phase is active. The watch has already seen it. And now, so have you. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this warning phase has already touched your life. It could be repeated pressure, strange coincidence, energetic heaviness, unexplained disruption, or the feeling that something is escalating beneath the surface. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who keeps dismissing the signs around them. And if you are ready to recognize the warning before it escalates, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a warning already in motion. And this is only the beginning.